It's completely outrageous that a national park would choose to kill Tule elk when their whole species is at such risk.
So I think it's time to let the elk do their work and restore this to what the mission of a national park should truly be. This is an embarrassment for the national park system.
Under federal law, when you have a federal park, it's required that there be an environmental impact report. In the existence of this park, we have never had one. It's in violation of federal law.
If the cattle ranchers would transition themselves away, they get to be heroes.
I fell in love with Point Reyes National Seashore. It was the first place I ever backpacked, it was the first place I ever camped, and I really just knew instantly that this was a special part of the world. This is actually the largest piece of protected coastline in the United States south of Alaska. It's home to 15% of all California biodiversity. It's really sort of an exceptional place for wildlife. 30% of the land here in our national seashore is leased to private dairy and cattle operations. 30% is a large number for a national park which is supposed to protect wildlife and biodiversity.
The landscape is in terrible condition where the cattle are. It's some of the most degraded habitat that I've seen in my 30-some years of tracking elk throughout their native range in California, so it's pretty bad. The cattle are running the show. Cattle just eat everything, they eat everything down to the ground. So the elk are discriminate feeders. They'll feed a little bit and they shift. They're a grazer and a browser, and so they won't destroy the habitat, and there's not enough of them to do that.
There are over 5,000 heads of cattle in Point Reyes National Seashore, and there are only about 500 elk total in the park. So cows outnumber elk 10 to 1. The elk population is not nearly big enough to be a problem for overgrazing or overpopulation. The elk are down to 1% of their original population.
Right now, we're pushing everything off of the cliff. They're trying to say there's enough Tule elk to kill here at Point Reyes, even when our scientists are saying, no, there's not enough genetic stock. We can't miss a single one. We need them all.
The only reason why the park is planning to kill the elk is to protect the ranching operations here. I was really upset. I figured if I, as a very involved volunteer and wildlife enthusiast, didn't know this was going on, maybe there's a lot of people who don't know that this is going on and they would be upset too. And maybe if we get a lot of people to hear about it, we can change how things are done here. So I founded this campaign, Save the Tule Elk, and I just started doing a lot of public outreach, and it turns out I was right. Most of the public I talk to are completely outraged that 30% of their public land is going to private industry. And most people are outraged at the fact that the National Park Service is planning to kill almost an extinct species to protect dairy and cattle operations.
We have a native Tule elk that's been reintroduced, that was hunted, wiped out locally for the sake of ranching, among other things, that was reintroduced by the park with the idea that when the leases were up on the ranches, that the fences would come down and that the elk would be allowed to free roam and increase their number, and that the park would sort of be returned to the way it was prior to human intervention. The issue we have now is the ranchers don't want to leave. They were supposed to be all gone in the 80s. These ranchers now not only want to stay, they want to have their leases extended, and they want to have the permission to expand their ranches into raising chickens, sheep, and maybe even opening bed and breakfast.
Ranchers here, both dairy and beef, were given handsome payouts. So the land was bought from them, and they were basically given a 25-year time period as a just transition so they could transition their businesses and move off the land. It was always intended that this land would be fully restored. The dairy farmers, as well as the beef ranchers, have continued to be given extensions on their leases, despite the fact that their presence here is really damaging to the land. You can see the visual impact of the cattle on the land by the scarring on the land, the loss of the topsoil. The places where the cattle are, there's very little biodiversity in the plant kingdom. Very few wild animals can go there.
Cattle are just destroying the habitat, and I'm sure most of the visitors here must be shocked, especially out in the pastoral lands, how degraded the landscape is. So I would assume that most of the public would rather see the native tule elk than the exotic cattle, which the public paid to have those ranches removed.
We have at least 23 unique creeks that empty out into the Tamales Bay. Those creeks are habitat to steelhead, trout, and salmon. Those are all being polluted by ranching so that the number of salmon is going down, the steelhead population is going down, and the river otters that eat them have also disappeared from those waterways.
I personally don't want my tax dollars paying to support an industry that's so cruel and so damaging to the environment.
The massive amounts of manure come from these operations every year is just everywhere. They put it into liquefied manure, they put it in sprayers and just spray it over the land. The places where cattle graze, a lot of it just runs down during the rainy season and just runs right into the ocean. They have things called poop lagoons that are just little ponds that the cows poop in, and so that's going to be seeping into groundwater.
So it's just an environmental disaster from an ecological perspective, just what the cattle manure is causing.
The river systems and lake systems here are in the top 10 worst in the state of California.
A lot of times the beaches are actually closed around here. A national park shouldn't be on a list of the most toxic beaches. The intent was that it was to preserve the natural values of this land for the enjoyment of the citizens.
Today I came out here with my wife and twin 5-year-olds. We've been camping in Alima nearby, and I want to show them the beautiful seashore. We're actually out here to see the tule elk so they can know what they are and just enjoy the overall landscape. It's really stunning. Cattle ranching out here on the seashore is not a great place for it. The impact it has on the beautiful seashore, and we have these lovely parks that are supposed to be enjoyed and shared and maintained in the long term, but the impact that they have on the land here is pretty destructive. People can't come and enjoy it if the cows are standing in the way.
We do come out here a lot, and one of the reasons we do come out here is because we love the elk. We love going out to the bluff, especially around wildflower season, and there's nothing like seeing the elk against the water with the wildflowers. The elk just seem to be part of Point Reyes. I would hate for anything to happen to them, and it seems like a really delicate situation that needs to be really thought about before any drastic moves are made, because I think a lot of people come out here to see the elk more than the cattle.
I'm an outdoorsman, like hiking. We hike every weekend and really take advantage of living by all these national parks. Why we live here is to be out here and kind of share the land. I'm against any proposal that would allow them to cull the elk for the ranchers. I'd rather the ranchers go than the elk go. It's a national park, and it should be exactly that. And if they're going to take away the elk, then I'd say the ranchers go before the elk do. Elk's been here a lot longer.
The dairy industry is completely terrible for the environment, and also it's just a cruel practice. Scattered throughout the seashore, you see these tiny plastic enclosures, and in them are baby cows. And the reason why the baby cows are in there is because that's what dairy farms have to do. If the baby cows drink the milk, then we don't get to drink the milk.
Anything that is cruel is unsustainable. anything that's kind is sustainable. So to me, sustainability is about morality. All that we consider to be good is sustainable. All that we consider to be evil is not sustainable.
Dairy cows require quite a significant amount more grass than even a beef cow does because they're milking mothers and they need a lot more nutrients to produce their milk. There's actually not enough land for these dairy cows to just graze and satisfy their appetites. And so there's acres and acres of silage mowing where they mow down grass and they feed it to the cows. And there's been 8 species of birds that have been documented as decreased population after these lawn mowers basically mow over the bird population.
If we just don't have the cows, the land will heal. The land will heal itself. And the Thule elk, they're an apex species. They're a big, important part of that healing.
And one of the main drivers of climate change is cattle grazing operations and dairy operations.
Within the next 12 years, if we don't start reversing climate change, we will definitely hit one of those tipping points, and then there is no stopping climate change. So it's like a runaway train.
As a national seashore, we need to be an example of what wildlife protection looks like and to actually fight climate change. As the climate starts to collapse around us, the more diversity we have, the more resilient the ecosystem is and the more adaptable that ecosystem will be to climate change in the future. Phasing out dairy industry is one way to do that that's very tangible and will be very effective.
And in a national park, they should be the ones on the front line of defense against climate change, protecting the native plants, protecting the native other species that will help restore the landscape and help ultimately fight climate change as well.
I look forward to a time when we actually respect the complex, beautiful nature that was already here. Nature knows how to heal better than we do.
I'm going to go over various ways that I think that ranching's hurting wildlife. But before I get into the specifics, just to paint a broad picture, think of what it was like before cattle came to Point Reyes Seashore and Golden Gate and basically the whole Bay Area. Instead of the short little European grasses with their, that die every summer and that they have roots that go down just a few inches and turn brown because their roots don't go down anymore. There were bunch grasses that had long roots. They stayed green almost all year. They were perennials. And then forbs and brush, which the ranchers complained about, but it was an important ingredient in providing food and habitat for many wildlife back then. Roaming around there, in addition to the animals we know about today, there were grizzly bears, pronghorn antelope, wolves, steelhead, and the coho salmon are hanging by a thread because the streams are so polluted. And the reason for this all is that ranching and the cattle came to Point Reyes Seashore and Golden Gate. So with that as sort of a broad background, let's look at several ways that ranching is impacting wildlife and nature in general. The first one example is manure spreading. This is manure spreading going on while I was photographing. The truck just left and was going back to the ranch to get another load of manure. Manure spreading causes lots of problems. First of all, it pollutes the waters of the seashore. It contributes to global warming. It spreads Johne's disease, which is a nasty disease that kills cattle and any other ruminant like deer and elk, given enough time. It's a slowly progressing disease, but it does eventually kill. And finally, in that manure mixed in it is lots of non-native seeds. And the way those seeds get in that manure is from the dairy cows' stomachs. They eat lots of hay that's trucked into the seashore, and that hay is grown in fields that are not 100% hay. They include lots of weeds, lots of plants that are non-native. The spreading of the manure entails a lot of problems. And the next thing is that, guess what? The silage growing and mowing that goes on in the seashore on 1,000 acres of the 2,500 acres of manure is another big problem. There you see a mower mowing silage, and you can see two windrows or lines of cut silage to the right in the picture, and lots of ravens picking up whatever they can find on the ground in the way of former, probably dead, but possibly just injured animal life of some kind. The silage has lots of problems. First of all, it's non-native. So it just adds non-native seeds to the non-native seeds that were put on the ground when the manure was spread. The most important, biggest problem with silage mowing, it's done in the spring, and guess what? That's when birds nest. Lots of birds nest in low situations like this, grasses that are just a foot or two or more high. Now this is a scene showing a mower having gone across this field on the I Ranch. While you saw the ravens before on the cut grass, the ground without any silage on it anymore, they were grabbing what they could, but the real prizes are in the windrows. That's where most of the body parts are from animals that have been chopped up. The ranchers hate coyote brush, and any chance they can, they like to get rid of it. To a rancher, a beautiful view, and it only exists in the wet months, is rolling hills of this European grass that is pretty. It looks like a golf course, but it's a biological desert. There's no food or cover for anything except, as I said, elk and deer to a lesser extent don't mind eating grass of any kind. But rabbits, quail, songbirds and stuff, there's nothing out there for them. And I suppose if you dropped a brush rabbit out there in the middle of 1,000 acres of short green grass, I'm sure it wouldn't make it to the nearest cover because a coyote or bobcat or red-tailed hawk or something would grab it. Another thing that the Park Service does all the time with the elk is they haze them. They chase them or herd them off of the parts of the D ranch that are leased to the C and E ranches. And some of those elk also go on to the B and A ranches. A is the closest to the lighthouse to orient you. If I did that to an elk in Yellowstone while I was photographing, I could be cited or arrested for violating a Park Service animal protection statute because I was harassing it. And yet the Park Service does it all the time out there, unless they've changed their habits or practices. I spoke to the Park Service several years ago, back in about 2014, when the word got out that they were going to be doing a environmental assessment on the idea of fine-tuning ranching to allow diversification and so forth. I got into a discussion with Park Service management, and I was there with several environmental people and a couple of environmental groups. And I asked them, the Park Service, what their position was on wildlife-friendly fencing, because there wasn't any in the park. I had measured the fencing on virtually every ranch. And they said they're not in favor of it. Although they said if it's interior fencing as opposed to exterior fencing, like what you see along the roads or separating ranches, I guess, we don't want it there. And I never got an answer as to why. But the DEIS says that it's going to do wildlife-friendly fencing. And I don't know how to interpret that, because I don't know if they mean just interior fences, like to separate pastures to the extent that goes on, or whether they're talking about the fences that are basically the boundaries for each lease. Fencing is bad to begin with, but it's especially bad if it's not wildlife friendly. wildlife-friendly fencing has become somewhat popular, but people that are reasonable, ranchers that are reasonable and so forth. And even the BLM and the Forest Service has developed standards or specifications for what they consider wildlife-friendly fencing to be on BLM and Forest Service land. They define it as fences that are no higher than 38 inches so that it's not hard to jump over a fence like that. There's no fence in Point Reyes that low. 3 strands of barbed wire only. The bottom one is smooth with no barbs. The bottom one is also 16 inches above the ground so that an elk, calf, or deer fawn, or pronghorn, because pronghorns, strangely, don't jump fences hardly ever. So they need to get under, and 60 inches seems to work for them. The one in the middle has to be at least 12, has to be 12 inches from the top wire. Now, the 16 inches on the ground is, of course, to let those little babies get under. The top one is so that the adults can jump over, not more than 38 inches high. The one below that has to be 12 inches, or preferably even 14, some would say, below the top wire. And you may say, well, why? What has that got to do with either jumping over or under, crawling under a fence? Well, this is a perfect example of it. This is a mule deer doe that my friend Larry Thorngren photographed. First of all, it has the worst fencing you can imagine. Woven wire fencing, those 4 and 6 inch squares, and sometimes they're rectangles. Nothing can get through that. And then at the top, for good measure, they've got 2 barbed wires. I don't know what the height of the fence is, but how did that happen? Well, here's how it happened. Pretend this rubber band is the top 2 wires on a fence. What happens is when a deer or an elk jumps, you might think they do like we do diving into a pool, but of course that would be a big crash on their head. So what they do is when they start to jump, their hind legs need to, facing forward, need to clear the top wire. If it gets under the top wire and above the second wire, it's called scissoring. And it's very simple to illustrate. Whoops. It just wraps around twisted. So if they make the fence tall enough, let's say this is 12 inches, then, the hind feet go through and don't catch the top, and then the animal's okay. So the fences in the park are all, some of them are as high as 48 inches. And the BLM says anything more than 42 or more is a deer can't be expected to clear, at least not every time. This photo is of an elk that died in the park just to the east of the home ranch. And notice on the bridge of the nose, the wire is actually growing inside the bone a bit. It's probably been pulled down into it. And then if we can go to the next photo, look at that wire through the jaw, halfway through the bone. I don't know how long this whole ordeal lasted, but I'm sure that animal suffered a lot. I don't think it was able to eat. I don't think it was able to drink. And finally, it just died. And it had to happen it had to suffer for a long time. It probably got worse as time went by and he tried to pull it off or whatever. But for the wire to grow up into the bone that far, or get up into the bone that far, that had to take a lot of time, and I'm sure it was a pretty painful ordeal for that elk. Cattle and barbed wire just don't belong in a national park. I've been to a lot of national parks. I've never seen a fence in any of them, except at Grand Teton, and I think I was actually on the private property adjacent to the federally owned parkland. So let's shift to another problem for wildlife. Importation, well, actually a problem for nature. Hay trucks come into the park all the time. They're usually 18-wheelers. I don't know, it's hard to tell how long this stack of hay is, but it's a long, long stack of hay. I don't know if it's 100 yards, 200 yards or whatever, but I went to the end and photographed it, but I didn't want to put it on here because it would take too much time too many pictures. But it was extremely wide, as it would need to be to support this much height. The biggest problem with bringing hay in, as I alluded to before, is that it's loaded with non-native seeds. And when those seeds are eaten by the cows, they leave the cow through manure, and wherever they land, they grow. So the Park Service should be requiring that the hay be certified weed-free. There is hay grown certified as weed-free. They make sure that the fields that it's grown in are completely free of weeds. It's a lot of extra work for the grower, but of course he gets more money for it. And the Park Service, by the way, requires, if you have a horse and you want to go to like Yosemite or some other park, you have to bring with you certified weed-free hay. And those bales come with a certification, a big label on them and stuff. It's not like, you can clearly tell at a distance whether it's certified weed-free. So the Park Service at Yosemite will require you, if you're bringing a horse into, overnight in the park, you have to bring in some certified weed-free hay. And yet at Point Reyes, they're bringing it in by the 18-wheeler basically every day. So I just can't believe that. In fact, the grazing plan that was written for this planning process by UC Berkeley range scientists. Those are people that are basically wedded to ranching. But they said that the Park Service should require certified weed-free hay in their grazing plan for the Park Service for this planning process. That never got mentioned in the DEIS. Another problem, moving on, is not allocating forage for elk and deer. The Park Service and the ranchers assume this, only allocate 100% of the forage on each ranch to the cattle. They don't allocate anything for wildlife like elk and deer. Again, the grazing plan written in, I think, 2019 for the Park Service for this planning process says that the Park Service should allocate forage on each ranch where elk exist. That was also not mentioned in the DEIS. You would think that the Park Service was in the business of just taking care of ranching and perpetuating it and doing whatever it could to protect, preserve ranching, when its legal obligation is to protect and preserve and restore the natural resources, including the wildlife that are in worse condition, to a condition that existed when nature was in control and it was normal. Another thing I want to show you is cattle trailing in the park. I don't know if you can tell how deep this erosion is, but it's like up to your hips in some spots. And that's because cattle were going up and down that hill. Eventually, I think they stopped them. They made them just go on the other side of the road. This is right before you get into the elk reserve at Pierce Point. It's on the left side of Pierce Point Road. So when it rains, these trails have become gullies, and the rainwater, along with soil that's loose and coming down with the rainwater, and any manure that might wash over land above these gullies, because the cows do use area above these gullies, would get in the gullies and go right down into Tomales Bay. This is across the road and just down slightly from the last photo. Again, here we have tremendous amount of erosion going on. These cows go up and down these trails and cause all this erosion, especially in areas where it's hilly. And as the vegetation is wiped away and the soil gets compressed and loosened by the hooves, and also it collects manure because the cows are using these trails every day. When it rains, all that manure and all that loose soil also goes down into Tomales Bay. To the left, outside the photo here, is about a 24 or 36-inch conduit pipe that is also bringing soil and manure from the other side of the road that's also washing down to Tomales Bay. Next photo is driving toward the lighthouse. More erosion, more cattle trails. That lead cow is drinking water that's pooled there. This photo, I'm not sure if it drains down to the left at Drake's Estero or to the right of the road down to the ocean. But it's draining one way or the other, and it's carrying whatever manure these cows poop in it every day. All the soil they're breaking up with their hooves is also going to be washed down either to Drake's Estero or the ocean. I just can't believe that the Park Service hasn't done something, but it's just incredible to me that they haven't. This is right across the road from the last photo. This one does drain to the beach at the ocean. Again, cattle trails, and it had rained a day or two before, and there's still water coming down. Cows use it every day, and they poop on it, and plus any manure that's up elevation from these trails is also, with sheet rain, it's going to get washed down, and once it lands in these fast conduits of trails, it just shoots down to the ocean. So we're getting a lot of sedimentation and nutrient and pathogen-based water pollution in violation of federal and state laws. The Park Service is required by those laws to do something about this, as well as the ranchers being required, but nothing gets done. If they were to do something, some of these trails are the only ways these animals can get to grazing lands that are flatter. And so they are sacrificed to allow as much grazing of grass as possible for the cows. Let's move on to water pollution. Virtually all the waters of Point Reyes and Golden Gate are impaired for sediments, nutrients, and/or pathogens, like E. coli. It harms coho salmon and steelhead trout in the cold water streams, and red-legged frogs and western pond turtles in the warm water areas. All of those are threatened under the Endangered Species Act, except pond turtles, which are a species of special concern, quote unquote. The DEIS admits the parks are polluted. There is a 2013 Park Service study called the 2013 Coastal Watershed Assessment that's even more critical of the pollution that's going on and has been going on for a long time. So I'm going to take you on a little trip right now down a creek. This, believe it or not, is the headwaters of the South Fork of Keogh Creek. It is a pond, a stock pond. The thing about this pond and all the ponds at Point Reyes is that they are all supposed to be, in terms of good animal husbandry, fenced. You put a perimeter fence around the pond, and then you take a pipe and run it to a water trough well away from the pond, down elevation, down grade, because you don't want your cattle drinking water that they've just peed and pooped in. It's not very good for them. But all those pathogens, all the nutrients are going down grade and causing pollution to an area that before the cattle were there, the pond wasn't there, and the water was just going down and staying clean. That manure you see, or poop you see coming out of that cow, the cattle at Point Reyes gave the Johne's disease to the elk. When the first 10 elk that were brought there in '78 were free of Johne's disease, as are all the other 21 herds that Cal Fish and Wildlife has responsibility for. And I was told by the guy that's the elk guy for Cal Fish and Wildlife that none of the other herds and none of the animals that were brought to Point Reyes in '78 have ever had Johne's. So they got it on Pierce Point Ranch, and it's affects some of them to this day. Okay, now this pond is totally covered in some kind of algae or weed or something. And the reason the pond is so covered is because nutrients in the form of manure, manure is a fertilizer, as you know, nitrogen and phosphorus, I think. I don't know the chemical pluses and minuses of what makes good fertilizer, but this pond has way too many nutrients. It's probably eutrophied, and cows are in there drinking it and pooping and whatever else. This pond is just on the other side of the road from the first pond. So the water in it largely is from the first pond that we just looked at. Now from here, this pond percolates, the water percolates through this dam at the right side that you can't see and goes downhill and finally winds up at the main stem of the South Fork of Keogh Creek. Believe it or not, this is a creek totally covered in sedges. These are two beef cows, not dairy cows. You can see they look like they're Angus, although I don't know if the white on the face means something else in addition to black Angus. But anyway, they're just munching away on aquatic vegetation, happy as two pigs in mud. And in the meantime, they're standing, the sedges wouldn't even be there, at least for the large part, if it weren't for the fact that there's so much manure in there. And the other problem is when those cows get in there, there still is, I mean, at places you do see open water, but most of it is just totally suffocated by all this vegetation growing in it. But the cows are also walking back and forth across the creek edges, which flattens the creek, makes it shallower and wider. So they're destroying it in that sense as well. Okay, now this is called Keogh Pond or Keogh Lagoon. This is where the South Fork and the North Fork of Keogh Creek meet. It's right at the Keogh Beach parking lot if you've ever been to Keogh Beach. Look at that. Why is it totally covered in vegetation? Because it's loaded with fertilizer from the manure. It would be open water if it weren't for all the manure. I'm sure before the cows got there, that probably was open water. With all that vegetation, including when it dies and it consumes oxygen as it dies and goes to the bottom of the lagoon or pond, it consumes oxygen and it makes it eutrophied. Eutrophication, which means basically it's a dead water zone. The water pollution in Point Reyes and Golden Gate are just unbelievable. The ranches attract ravens because of the food they put out, whether it's silage or whatever, grains. There's a tremendous number of ravens living off the ranches, and they go right over to the beach and kill all the little snowy plovers that they can get their little claws on, which wouldn't happen if it weren't for the ranches. Those of you that are familiar with the elk reserve at Pierce Point, the Tamales Point Elk Reserve, I think the Park Service calls it, what a travesty that is. It doesn't have water adequate year-round in times of drought. And because of that, half of the 500 elk herd there died during the drought. It's Park Service policy, one, never to contain wildlife. And these elk have been contained since 1978. The 1998 elk plan said that the Park Service should not be holding these elk there, that it's contrary to Park Service wildlife management policy, and it's also going to lead to deaths of elk during droughts. And of course, they were certainly proven right on that when 250 of them died during that last drought. The shooting of elk. I can't believe that the Park Service its focus is to shoot as many elk as it takes to keep the ranchers happy. And the ranchers want all of them shot. I'm talking about the Drake's Beach herd only. That's where the 3 dairy ranches are that complain about the elk eating their grass, quote unquote. But I just, I find it hard to believe that the Park Service is proposing to shoot wildlife in order to make users private businesses in national parks happy because they want 100% of the grass or most of the grass. So they're either going to, alternative B is they're going to just keep the herd at 120 animals and they shoot whatever the excess is every year, or alternative C, the one the ranchers want, is shoot all the elk, get it all done in 6 months or less. So anyway, I can't believe the Park Service runs a national park like Point Reyes this way. And that's about it.